This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot, and the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time. What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out-of-touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
This episode is brought to you by the world's first reposado from Tequila Herradura. Made with slow-cooked, hand-harvested agave sealed into oak barrels and aged 11 months. Before being enjoyed in your glass. Experience the world's first reposado. Tequila Herradura. Please drink responsibly. Responsibility.org. Tequila Herradura. 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Brown-Forman, Louisville, Kentucky. Herradura is a registered trademark. Copyright 2025 Brown-Forman Corporation.
It's Wednesday, Adams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your unbanal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday, Season 2. Begins August 6th. Only on Netflix.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 87, Bad Seed.
My name's Rolf Norton. I'm a Seattle Police homicide detective. The story's graphic and it's awful and it's just, it's difficult to stomach. It's just really, truly a nightmare of what happened to her.
One's worst nightmare. It's an expression that's often used facetiously to casually jazz up a story that you tell your friends. He was terrified of spiders, so one crawling up his back was his worst nightmare. But the day of December 11th, 1974, was literally the beginning of what would ultimately become Renee Wickland's worst nightmare.
From talking to at least one of Detective De Palma's relatives years later, that this was one of the most unsettling cases that he had ever investigated. And this was someone who spent years and years in the homicide unit.
Renee was outside, enjoying an unseasonably warm December day in the Pacific Northwest with her 1-year-old daughter, Shauna. Her husband was away on business, so she was alone with her baby. Renee's little family lived in Clearview, Washington, a small community in Snohomish County, about 35 minutes away from Seattle. Her nearest neighbors were the Hendricksons, a married couple, Barbara and Dawn. Even though Renee's husband was away from home a lot because of work, she could always count on the Hendricksons, who lived about a quarter of a mile away. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, the kind of rural place where Renee, when she saw a young man walking near her home, he was tall with wild-looking reddish-brown hair, and there was something off-putting about his manner. It made her really uncomfortable. She immediately scooped up her baby and headed for the house. Inside, she began shutting the door when she felt it being pushed open from the outside. Then, that same young man thrust a knife at her precious little girl's throat, threatening that if Renee didn't do exactly what he said, he would kill her daughter. The stranger then forced Renee to perform a sex act while he held a knife to her 1-year-old's throat. After her assailant fled her home, Renee picked up her daughter and rushed to her neighbor's house. Barbara Hendrickson was home alone, and without hesitation, she hugged Renee and ushered mother and baby inside. She called 911, loaded a shotgun, and locked all the doors, preparing herself should the stranger come back. That day, Renee would provide a very detailed description of the suspect to the police, but he would remain a fugitive.
The suspect escaped and was not identified for some time, really was not identified for about 13 months It was an unknown, open case, horrible sexual assault. The circumstances were just very difficult to get a handle of. You have a victim inside her own residence in a quiet neighborhood, with her infant daughter, not engaging in lifestyle decisions that would put her at risk in any way. And someone broke into her house, and her child was there, and sexually assaulted her in the presence of her child, threatened to kill the child if she didn't do certain things. The story's graphic, and it's awful, and it's just, it's difficult to stomach. It's just really, truly a nightmare of what happened to her.
13 months later, 20-year-old Charles Rodman Campbell was in eastern Washington, serving a 15-year sentence for second-degree burglary when he was identified as a suspect in Renee Wickland's sexual assault. Campbell would be brought back to Snohomish County, where Renee would identify him in a lineup. Renee Wickland and her neighbor Barbara Hendrickson would testify at Campbell's trial, and he would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree assault and sodomy.
He went to trial later in 1976 and was found guilty of raping Renee Wickland. And he went to prison. During his sentencing hearing, he told the judge, he told everyone present in court that day, that when he got out of prison, that he was going to kill Renee Wickland, her daughter, and Ms. Wickland's next-door neighbor who testified against him.
At the time of Campbell's sentencing, remember, he was already serving a 15-year sentence for burglary, and the judge in Renee's case would add another 30 years.
So at the time, he's sentenced for 40 years. And I think, I wasn't there, but I imagine everyone present was like, yeah, right, we'll see in 40 years. But that's not what happened, because his sentences were concurrent, meaning not added on top of each other. And Charles Campbell got out of prison after about 7 years.
You might be wondering, how does a violent offender serving more than 40 years get off? It's because he received a concurrent sentence, which is a type of sentence a judge is able to give a defendant who is convicted of more than one crime. Instead of serving each sentence one after another, a concurrent sentence allows the defendant to serve both of their sentences at the same time, where the longest period of time is controlling. So in Campbell's case, that meant the conviction of sexual assault and sodomy, which was a 30-year sentence, with a 7.5-year minimum, which was controlling. So he got out after serving only 6 years with good behavior. During those 6 years, Renee Wickland had tried to piece together her life. It hadn't been easy. In fact, her marriage to Shanna's father had fallen apart and ended in divorce. However, through hard work, she was able to provide a stable home for her and her daughter, and throughout it all, she had the support of the Hendricksons, who had stood by her side through those tough years. One thing that had made life easier for them all was knowing that Charles Campbell had been put away for more than 40 years. According to a psychologist who had interviewed Charles Campbell in 1979, he would go on to describe him as, quote, imminently harmful to all who directly or indirectly capture his attention or interest. Campbell, in his own words, would say, "The world has created me, and I am free to do what I want. There's no right or wrong or anyone to tell me what to do." This was Charles Campbell's mindset when he was released to a halfway house just 5 miles away from Renee Wickland in early 1982. Renee and her neighbors, the Hendricksons, had no idea that their worst nightmare had been released from prison, that he was already casing their homes. The thing is, even though Renee had no idea that Campbell was out of prison, living close to her home, she felt a presence, as if she were being watched. She was always looking out of the windows of her home. Was there someone out there? The double guessing was exhausting, terrifying, traumatic. Was there someone really out there, or was this the trauma from the attack that was never going away, no matter how hard she tried? That winter, Renee would observe footprints in the snow by her home. She never saw anyone, and nothing came of it. It was April 14th, 1982, and 31-year-old Renee was at her home recovering from a bad case of strep throat. That day, her now 8-year-old daughter, Shauna, had returned home from school, and her 51-year-old next-door neighbor, Barbara, had told her husband at around 4 o'clock that she was going to go check in on Renee and help Shauna make Jell-O. Don started to worry a bit at first when Barbara didn't return, but he figured that his wife was just having a good time. But after a couple of hours, he decided to go over to the Wickland residence to make sure that everything was okay. When he walked up to the house, he pushed open the door and was immediately uncomfortable by the silence. Then he saw his beloved wife of more than 30 years on the floor in the house. Her throat had been slashed. Upstairs, he would find Renee, naked, horribly beaten. Her throat had been cut. Close to her mother's body was her 8-year-old little girl, whose throat had been cut too.
In April of 1982, Charles Campbell, while on work release, went back to Snohomish County and broke into Renee Wickland's house and murdered her and her 8-year-old daughter, Shanna, and, as he had said before, the next-door neighbor, Barbara Hendrickson, the woman who testified against him in the rape trial in 1976.
When investigators arrived at the Wicklands' house, they took in the horrific, cold-blooded murders. Right away, they believed the motive was revenge. Had Renee been the target, and her daughter and Barbara collateral damage? Detectives asked Don who would want to take revenge on Renee and her daughter. He told them no one. Renee's ex-husband, Shauna's father, had died in a car accident in 1978. Don would say that the only person who would want to hurt Renee and his wife would be Charles Campbell. But that wasn't possible because he was in prison serving a 40-year sentence. It wouldn't take investigators long to find out that it wasn't true. That Charles Campbell had been released to a halfway house in late February, a place he was free to come and go as he pleased, so long as he abstained from drugs and alcohol. They went to speak with Charles Campbell, but when they got to the halfway house, they found out that the night of the murders, he'd come back home so intoxicated and belligerent that he'd been transferred back to the minimum security prison, which he'd been released from. A few days after the homicides, Charles Campbell would be charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. A triple homicide would send shockwaves throughout the community and across the state, especially after the terrifying circumstances behind what appeared to be revenge killings against Renee Wickland and Barbara Hendrickson, who had bravely come forward to testify, trusting that the system would protect them. But the system hadn't protected them, and it appeared that they'd been murdered by the same man who had threatened to take revenge upon them 6 years before in open court.
So it's really unfathomable. How could this happen? How could someone do such an awful crime in 1976, go to prison, and get out and, just like he said he was going to do, committed a triple murder? A different era, a lot of things in play. You know, this was a case that started the process of victim notification, of offender release, really got that going for obvious reasons.
Charles Campbell would enter a not guilty plea. His trial was set for June 1982. Evidence presented in court was damning. Campbell's bloody fingerprint would be collected from a glass that was found in the kitchen. Neighbors would also testify that they saw a man matching Campbell's description lurking around the Wicklands residence that day, and that they'd also seen a car matching Campbell's parked near a wooded area by the Wickland home. And items seized from Campbell the night he came back to the work release program drunk included a pair of Renee's earrings. Another work release resident would direct police to a place on the Snohomish River where he and Campbell had been on the night of the murders. In the river, divers would find a bracelet, 3 earrings, 2 necklaces, a piece of pottery, and a brass object, all of which were linked to the Wickland residence and the victims. In November of 1982, a jury would convict Campbell on all 3 counts of aggravated murder.
Pled not guilty. This went to jury trial and he was found guilty. And then he was sentenced to death.
But it wasn't that simple. Charles Rodman Campbell would go on to fight his sentence for the next 11 years. exhausting every appeal, using every legal maneuver in an effort to escape the gallows.
Back then, an inmate sentenced to death was given the choice of lethal injection or death by hanging, and Charles Campbell refused to make a choice. I think I find it significant that knowing what we do about the crimes he committed both in 1974 and then in 1982, and you just shake your head at that. And then when it came time for him to receive his sentence, he fought. He wouldn't give in, cowered in the very end.
He was given two choices, to die by lethal injection or hanging. But he wouldn't choose, which meant the state had to make his choice for him. And, according to the law, the default method was death by hanging. Here's Charles Campbell giving his opinion about how cruel a death by hanging sentence was.
Death is not instantaneous with hanging, and that a lot of people, it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes to die. And that's a long time to be, hanging up there. It's a very ghastly way to die.
The irony was galling to so many. How could this cold-blooded, sadistic, sociopathic killer who had no empathy for his victims expect mercy? In the end, there would be no mercy. By May of 1994, the clock had run out for 39-year-old Charles Campbell. His execution was set for May 27th.
Hey, it's Sydney Sweeney. I'm not here to tell you to buy American Eagle jeans. And I definitely won't say that they're the most comfortable jeans I've ever worn. Or that they make your butt look amazing. Why would I need to do that? But if you said that you want to buy the jeans, I'm not going to stop you. But just so we're clear, this is not me telling you to buy American Eagle jeans.
Sydney Sweeney, Hasbro jeans.
You see what I did there, right?
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
The day before, prison guards went to take Campbell from his regular cell on death row to a separate building at the Walla Walla Penitentiary solely used for executions. But Campbell refused to leave his cell. He was so combative that guards would have to subdue him with pepper spray. Eventually, they were able to get him to that cell near the gallows. And for the next 24 hours, Campbell and his attorney would use every minute to get a stay of execution, but it didn't come. At 12:01 a.m. on May 27th, guards would come to his holding cell to walk him to the gallows. But Campbell refused, saying he couldn't walk. A collapsible board was produced, which carried an unwilling Campbell to the hangman's noose. Propping him up in front of a viewing room were victim's family, members of the media, his attorney, and a prosecutor would witness the execution. The lighting in the room was subdued, and the audience could only see the dim silhouette of Charles Campbell. Campbell was asked if he had any final words to share. He declined. A black hood was placed over his head, then a noose around his neck. It was 12:08 when the executioner pushed a red button, releasing the trapdoor below his feet. A doctor would pronounce Charles Campbell dead at 12:14 a.m.
I think you're all aware that the Department of Corrections has pronounced Charles Campbell dead after executing him shortly after midnight on Friday, May 27th. It's been a long and hard battle for many people in this case, long and hard time for the victims, families. They have had to deal with an immense tragedy for many years, and we're very grateful that they can now put this behind them. If a state is going to have a death penalty, as the state of Washington does, it is clear to us that Charles Campbell is the kind of case that the death penalty is meant for.
In 1994, this was an era where our state really wasn't engaging in that like in previous decades. And that speaks to why Charles Campbell was sentenced to death in 1982, and then that sentence was not fulfilled until 1994. It was the last execution by hanging in Washington state, and I believe it may have been the third last execution overall.
But the case didn't end there. That's a whole nother story, which requires us going back in time to April of 1975. 4 months after Renee was first attacked by Charles Campbell in December of 1974 in Snohomish County. A little over 30 minutes away, in Seattle, 25-year-old Hallie Ann Seaman was a student at the University of Washington. She was working toward her master's degree in architecture.
She was a great student. She was driven. She was motivated. She was popular. By all accounts, she seems like an incredible person and just beginning her professional life. She was last seen on the night of Tuesday, April 29th, 1975, about 9:40 p.m. by a co-student of hers. She was working in her office. Nothing out of the ordinary was going on, but her presence was noted.
The next day, Wednesday, April 30th, just after noon, and a man was taking his lunch break near a parking lot on East Lake Avenue and Roy Street, a couple miles south from Hallie's apartment.
The area underneath I-5 is dense and overgrown and not built up with buildings and that sort of thing. This individual was out at lunch and he saw something in the sticker bushes and he went closer and found a body. A young female, partially clothed, laying in the overgrown bushes, clearly deceased. The police and medical response started, and of course, it was obvious that she had died, and it was clear to the investigators who responded that she had been sexually assaulted and that she had been attacked at a different location and her body was left there.
The unidentified woman had been stabbed repeatedly.
This is midweek on a Wednesday. Sure, we're going to go look at missing persons reports, but it's 1975. Okay, these reports aren't automated. This isn't getting on a computer and saying who's been reported missing in the last 2 days. We have paper files and they go through the routes they need to go through before they come to a missing persons detective. So really, you're looking at least a couple days before a missing persons detective has his hand on a report saying, we're looking for this person.
The detectives working the case enlisted the help of the media to identify the young woman.
In the meantime, on May 1st, that Thursday, Hallie Seaman's sister reported her missing. Her family hadn't heard from her. They talked to her every day, so that report was made. It wasn't linked to this victim until the next day when the UW architecture professor saw the news coverage and was like, Hallie Seaman didn't show up to class today. She doesn't miss class. And he called in and detectives were able to make contact with the Seaman family and they were able to positively identify her.
The family asked the police about Hallie's car, a white 1965 Ford Fairlane station wagon.
And again, 1975, you don't have your hands on everything going on in the city just at your disposal. Stolen cars aren't even automated. Plates have to be run by hand. So the detectives started looking into that and they realized that at 2:40 a.m. on April 30th, this is 10 hours before Hallie Seaman was found, Seattle firefighters responded to a car fire at 8th and Holgate in the Soto neighborhood, right there on the train tracks. There was a white Ford Fairlane, fully engulfed. They put out the fire. There was not a Seattle Police Department response at that point, maybe just for traffic control, but there's no way of checking that plate right away, and it just, at that point, wasn't overly suspicious. Well, once our victim was identified as Hallie Seaman, then realized that's her car. A few days later, her car keys were found just a few feet away from where the Fairlane was put on fire.
Hallie's station wagon was set ablaze about 4 miles from where her body was found. Investigators were now able to piece together that Hallie was last seen at around 9:40 p.m. on Tuesday, April 29th, leaving her office at the UW campus.
They came across a witness who stepped forward and said, hey, saw this news coverage. At 10:30 on the night of April 29th, I was at 8th and Northeast 40th Street. That's about 5 or 6 blocks away from the corner of the UW campus, near where the UW school architecture building would be, and it would be the route that Hallie Seaman would have taken if she was going home. This witness said that they were driving by the intersection. They saw a white Ford-type vehicle, and they saw a man pulling a woman into the car. That's directly in line from where she would have left to the direction/location of where she was found, and also the direction location of where her vehicle was found. Now, we don't know for sure whether that was her, and we don't know for sure whether that was her perpetrator, but it is intriguing, and from a timeline perspective, it certainly makes sense.
Detectives Benny DePalmo, Wayne Dorman, and Don Strunk tirelessly worked the case. They immediately ruled out Hallie's boyfriend, who was extremely cooperative and had an alibi. And the deeper they dug into Hallie's life, the more it became clear that there appeared to be no one with a motive to harm Hallie, which led investigators to strongly believe that she'd been murdered by a stranger.
Early May 1975, this is an absolute mystery, and the investigation begins and going in two different directions, where they were looking at who knew Hallie Seaman, who did she regularly interact with, who did she come in contact with that they knew she would be in communication with, versus another direction, possibility of a complete stranger, random attack. You know, sadly, in that era, there wasn't a database of registered sex offenders that we would have the opportunity to pour through now, but you had definitely who's who of identified sexual assault suspects who you would take a look at. We've already talked about possibility of Ted Bundy. Time went on. At some point, the Green River Task Force got involved in this case, and the timeline doesn't work with that really well because it's a little bit before that individual started committing the crimes that he committed. But there was dozens and dozens and dozens of leads followed up on, and this was an incredibly thorough investigation, and I have to throw out my respect to Detectives DePalma, Dorman, and Strunk, because it was impressive to look at it 30 plus years later and see what they were able to put together.
Detective Norton began reviewing Hallie's case in August of 2017. One of the first things he did was to go out to where Hallie's body had been found back in 1975. And it was a stark reminder of just how much detective work had changed since then.
I took a step back and realized that if that crime occurred, not just in 2017 when I was looking at it, but say it occurred today, we would have Hallie Seaman on video leaving UW campus. We might have the incident of her getting accosted captured on camera. We would have the dumping area on video. We would have the suspect. We would have the abandoning of the car and lighting it on fire on video. We would have pictures of a suspect that we could disseminate. We might not have great ones of his face, but we would have physical characteristics and something to put out there and follow up on. And, the strategies that we could use today just didn't exist in 1975. Not even close.
In Hallie's murder book, Detective Norton discovered that in 2002, a detective had submitted forensic evidence from her 1975 autopsy to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab.
In 2002, Detective Richard Gagnon picked this case up and recognized that forensic evidence from the autopsy existed, and he submitted that to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for DNA analysis. And in October of 2002, scientist William Stubbs was able to identify a male profile that clearly belonged to the suspect, and that profile was searched in CODIS, which is our felon offender database, with no hits, meaning we had suspect DNA, but our suspect DNA wasn't in our library of felons.
Detective Norton was keen on sending that suspect DNA profile to a private lab, who would conduct a genetic genealogy workup to potentially identify her killer.
So I reached out to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, and the answer I received from them was that all forensic evidence that was collected at the autopsy was consumed. Not discarded, not destroyed, meaning in order for them to get that suspect DNA profile, they needed to take all of that forensic evidence and use it all. If they had more, they would have saved it. It would have been extra and would have been put back into evidence. But at the end of the day, to do genetic genealogy, you need that original forensic evidence because it needs to be reformatted into a different type of file in order to be entered into a genealogy website. Okay, so you need more. You can't just have the conclusion that the crime that came up with. You need extra that needs to go to a private laboratory and get reformatted. Nothing left, all gone.
How did you feel? Were you just crestfallen?
Yeah, I was really disappointed because, especially now, this case would have been solved by genetic genealogy if we could have gone that route. Fortunately, we had a different opportunity pop up. But yeah, I was very disappointed because there's not too many cases that we have, especially here at the Seattle Police Department, that you have a DNA profile, it's not in CODIS, and you know it's the suspect's DNA, okay? And that's a key, because this isn't a strategy that we'd use for like DNA on a discarded cigarette that might be in play or might not be in play, because the process takes time, it costs money, and you don't have unlimited resources. But if you have DNA and you know it's the suspect's, it's go time. And this is a strategy that, depending on the era, this will lead you to a conclusion.
Yeah.
So yeah, disappointed. But I went back to, hey, the dude's in that murder book.
So once again, another detective was diligently working Hallie's case. She had not been forgotten. They just needed something to point the investigation in a new direction. As it would turn out, Detective Norton wouldn't have to wait long. In August of 2023, he received an incredible email from William Stubbs, a forensic scientist at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab.
He sent me an email saying, "Hey Rolf, I'm going to be sending you a lab report on the 1975 Hallie Seaman case. I don't know if you remember it, but I think you'll find it interesting." So I got him on the phone and I was like, yeah, I remember it, A, and B, okay, surprised me. Next day he sent me the report and he was right. I was blown away. He surprised me. So the unknown DNA profile recovered from Hallie Seaman belonged to Charles Campbell, who I immediately recognized the name. Everything he was involved in and his ultimate execution occurred before I even was a Seattle Police Department employee. But I remember the story. This is the guy that committed that horrible, horrible rape, went to prison, got out, and killed everyone involved, the original victims and the witness who testified against him. And here he is. He's linked and identified as the person responsible for Hallie Seaman's murder.
The original detectives had about 120 names listed as potential suspects, but none of them were Charles Campbell. All the work that goes on behind the scenes, in many cases, unsung heroes that often lead to the identification of killers in unsolved cases. Detective Norton credits the Seattle Police Department detectives in 1975 who tirelessly worked Haley's case. And then in 2002, when another detective submitted the forensic evidence to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab that would ultimately lead to identifying a genetic profile of the killer, which would be uploaded into CODIS. All those breadcrumbs were in play. The last piece in helping to solve Hallie Ann Seaman's murder came in the form of legislation passed in 2019, a mandate to get DNA samples from convicted rapists and murderers, living or dead, who weren't in CODIS.
Legislation regarding CODIS initially established that everyone convicted of a qualifying offense after 1990 would have DNA collected and entered into that database, which means offenders that committed qualifying offenses, murders, rapes, sexual assaults, prior to 1990 were not in CODIS. So that's pretty shocking, right? And that's a lot to think about, and especially thinking about older unsolved cases.
Retired Tacoma Police Detective Lindsay Wade had been working for the State Attorney General's office and had hand-selected Charles Campbell as someone she wanted to get into CODIS.
Individuals that committed qualifying offenses prior to 1990 to be searched through CODIS. And that included offenders that were deceased, and potentially included offenders that were serving life sentences but were convicted prior to 1990. But it wasn't an automatic thing. It's not like everyone that met those criteria was entered into CODIS. Individuals were selected. And a retired Tacoma Police Detective, Lindsay Wade, in that time, 2019, she was looking at a list and she selected Charles Campbell as one of the individuals that she wanted searched through CODIS. And it was a wonderful decision. Serendipity for us really, really, really recognized what that meant for this investigation. And also Charles Campbell would not have been a for sure first pick as far as searching through CODIS, because look at his timeline. He was 20 years old in 1974 when he committed that rape. And we know he was out of custody for 13 months, but then he's been in custody since 1982. So this is not like some of the other people that we are investigating that have been running around for a whole decade and we're like, where have you been? What have you been doing? We had a very small window.
Which begs the question, what else don't we know about Charles Campbell and what he might have done in that tight window between late 1974, when he was just 20 years old, and early 1976, before he was arrested?
Okay, 13 months. He was out for 13 months, and he'd already started doing what he was doing. He raped Renee Wicklund. He threatened to kill her infant daughter. A few months later, he rapes and kills Hallie Seaman, and he doesn't get arrested until January of 1976. What else is there? What don't we know, or what don't we know about? And I guess that question has not been answered yet. We continue to delve and look. What else is there?
Detective Rolf Norton says the investigation continues, but he always keeps the victims in the forefront of everything he does.
And I also want to say that this story should be about Hallie Seaman and who she was, and not be overshadowed by the monster Charles Campbell was and continues to grow as. It's really important to recognize that, and her life and the good things she brought, and also realize that, this is tragedy, it's not entertainment. And perspective is truly, truly important regarding that.
Up next, our bonus episode on Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. Here, my co-host and I discuss the case, including details that didn't make it into the episode. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production, recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself. Music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.